Welcome to a special recording of Vantage Point. I'm here at Taman Tasik Perdana, but it's a very, very important event that's happening, and it's about the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal. On the sidelines of that, I would like to look at certain things regarding crime and war and how to criminalize war, because economic sanctions, for example, more and more they are being used as a tool against an entity or a nation. And if we look at it, a lot of the time, or most of the time, it's the people who are being punished, people of that particular area. So I would like to introduce my guest first. Closest to me would be Mr. Denis Halliday, former UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. And then, of course, we have Professor Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of JUST, the International Movement for a Just World. And maybe I can start with painting a picture, because when I was in the tribunal sessions and listening in from the press section, no matter how much experience you have, but when you hear about atrocities and the sufferings suffered by the people, especially in Iraq, what we're discussing here, it's just unfathomable of how far people can go. So if I link that to economic sanctions, too many times the powers that be will be targeting certain section of the nation, usually the leaders or the government. But again and again, we see that it's the people who suffered the most. So if economic sanction again and again is being used as a tool for war or for whatever else, why is it that we can let this happen when we know that it's the people, the laymen on the streets, the babies that are denied the infant formulas and diapers, for example, and old people that are denied their medication are the ones that suffered the most? We cannot just let this go on. So maybe Professor Dr. Chandra, I'll start with you first.
Thank you, Kamrul. I would regard economic sanctions, especially economic sanctions imposed by a hegemonic power in pursuit of its hegemonic agenda, as a war crime. You can have economic sanctions of a different kind, and we've had different types of economic sanctions with different purposes, different goals, and so on. But if you're looking at Iraq, it was clearly linked to hegemony. Economic sanctions against Iraq, which led eventually to the invasion and occupation of Iraq, began on the 6th of August 1990, went on until 2003, economic sanctions, which had the blessings of the UN. Now, if you look at what had happened at that time, we know that after the Kuwait War, when the sanctions were intensified, over a period of perhaps a decade plus, something like, what, 650,000 children died. And this was a consequence of economic sanctions. There is no way one can justify actions of this sort. But why they happen, Kamrul, it's because I suppose the powerful, they make the rules, they enforce their will, and most of the time the weak are in no position to resist this. This has been the story of humankind for thousands of years. Yes. So I suppose that's one way of explaining why things like this happen. And if you look at Iraq in particular, there were a lot of voices that were against the economic sanctions. But somehow those voices did not change the position of the powerful. Those of the Security Council, others who had supported them, and all the rest of it. So that, I suppose, is the real challenge before us. Economic sanctions imposed upon a particular country with a nefarious agenda of this sort. You want to control, dominate, control their oil, control strategic routes, serve the larger interests of Israel and things of that sort. Now, these are things which will happen as long as the global power structure remains what it is. That is what has to change. And that's where I think we should be focusing our attention, how to change the global power structure.
Mr. Halliday, even for humanitarian aid, nowadays people talk about sustainable humanitarian aid. That means not just giving things or resources, but empowering people within the area or affected areas to help themselves build infrastructures and stuff like that, give education, for example. But if it's used as a weapon, then a lot of things will be denied, and it's not only direct needs, but also education, for example, and the unity between races, ethnic and religion, for example, will be tested because of the denied things that's supposed to be gotten by a society. So if I link that to Iraq, even before the first incursion of the first war, sanctions were already been put in place, and that led to the war later after that, and again people suffered more, but the sanctions were still there. So only after 2003 that the sanctions towards Iraq was reconsidered and lifted. So more than 1 decade, and people would have suffered more even if there were no wars, but from the sanctions itself. So how do you look in the case of Iraq?
Well, let me take a step back, if I may. The terms of reference of the Security Council, indeed the United Nations, were agreed upon by 3 thugs, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, at Yalta in 1945. They created a Security Council charged with peace and security, which they knew then, and they have done ever since. It's used it to forward their own hegemonic or other ambitions for their own countries, how to exploit others, whether it's energy or whatever it may happen to be. So today, the Security Council is the most corrupt part of the United Nations. We see the Americans or the British or the Russians or the Chinese or the French putting through decisions or vetoing proposals, not guided by humanitarian needs or any other decent peace type proposal, but only to serve their vested interests. As Clinton and Madeleine Albright said repeatedly, the only added value of the United Nations is that it forwards our foreign policy. Well, of course, that is not the concept that we hope the UN would produce after the failure of the League. Now, sanctions themselves, of course, are technically legal. They come out of Chapter 7, Article 41 of the Charter, which is supposedly proposes non-violent means of coercing a member state to come back into compliance with the wishes of the Council. In reality, sanctions, as the professor has suggested, are violent. They're a form of warfare. And as you've explained, they constitute collective punishment. Collective punishment is itself a violation of international law, because you don't like a Saddam Hussein, let's say, or a Gaddafi, or whoever it may happen to be, whoever victim is chosen by our Western so-called democratic friends and neighbors and all the rest of it. The pain is borne by the people. And today, I think we recognize now that the economic sanctions on Iraq were unique, irreparably damaging. They were comprehensive in a way that nothing has ever been attempted before or after. And secondly, they were open-ended. And open-ended means that you need a resolution of the Council to stop them. And that turned out to be impossible. That's why for 13 years, as the professor said, we had these comprehensive economic sanctions. And the irony is that war criminal and all the rest that Mr. Bush, of course, undoubtedly is, he ended sanctions. But of course he ended sanctions by invading the country. And the damage he did is even worse than sanctions yielded. And as we know, although you said 650 people died or children died, I think overall we now talk of probably 1 million or more died. And they died not from famine or starvation per se, but they died because the Americans, in violation of Geneva Conventions, bombed the infrastructure. And bombing infrastructure is a violation of international law. They destroyed the electric power, the sewage systems, the water systems. Children died from polluted water and baby formula. They didn't actually die of famine. And the humanitarian program, which you referred to, I myself was instructed by the Secretary General, Mr. Halliday, you're not running a development program. You're running a humanitarian program. And sustainability and humanitarian assistance are actually incompatible concepts. They don't really work together.
I have to go for the first break, but once we are back, how do we move forward from here? Because we know what's not right, but how to make it right, or at least move toward what's right, we'll discuss after this short break. Sanctions themselves, in themselves, are war crimes. So that's where we are, and we've heard a lot that have been deliberated in the first segment, but how do we move forward? Maybe I'll pass it to Mr. Halliday first, because you've been with the United Nations, but you resigned because of your principles that it's not going to help if what they're going to do will be done, and it has sadly been done.
Right. Well, the member states in December of 1998, just after I left the UN and left Iraq, I was invited to London to have a discussion on what was known as, quote, smart sanctions, unquote. Now, smart sanctions, the concept is that you focus your sanctions not on the people, not on the collective punishment thing. You go for the head of state and his collaborators and his cabinet or his parliamentarians, and you punish them. So that's the name of the game for Iran today.
Okay.
But we know perfectly well it doesn't work, because you stop the banking, you stop the shipment, you stop the imports, you stop the insurance coverage, the economy crumbles.
Yes.
Who pays the price? It's the people at the bottom. The price of food goes up, the price of cooking oil goes up, the price of heating oil goes up. So it's again the same issue, it's collective punishment. So any form of sanctions, smart or not smart, it's not a way to go, it's not the future. So the way forward, in my mind, is having dialogue. We've got to listen to each other, talk to each other, not go in sticks and carrots, as the Americans like to say. Just go in as human beings and deal with our friends or our enemies, or whatever you want to call them, as fellow human beings with our own problems, which we maybe can address, and together we can solve our international differences.
But even that, Professor Dr. Chandra, sometimes is difficult to do, to talk. And we have always been saying that around this region, Southeast Asia, we are very diverse. But sometimes, I would like to quote distinguished Professor Dr. Shamsul Amri on this, like for example in Malaysia. He said that we are always existing in a stable tension. We might be in the same area, or we might be in the same room, but we don't really talk to one another. We just coexist, for example. And whenever that is tested, so that's when crises or problems arise. So how do you look at this? I know you've been pushing dialogue for a long, long time, ever since I was a student, you know, gate crashing your classes, but how do we move this forward? Yeah. This is the 21st century. There are more tools to do that nowadays, bypassing the powers that be that wouldn't want to see that happen, but maybe it's not happening fast enough.
Well, I was wondering if I could use an example from within ASEAN.
Yes.
You have this example of Myanmar. Sanctions were imposed upon Myanmar, mainly by the United States and the European Union. None of the ASEAN countries agreed to impose sanctions. In fact, they were all opposed to it. How did ASEAN deal with Myanmar? It was dialogue. Bringing Myanmar into ASEAN, the West powers are totally against it, but the one man who pushed for it was someone called Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who was Prime Minister at that time. He felt that Myanmar should be in the ASEAN family, that one would have greater leverage over Myanmar if Myanmar was part of ASEAN, in spite of what Myanmar was at that time, you know how repressive the regime was, but Mahathir felt that one had to bring Myanmar in. Dialogue. And dialogues took place in formal and informal ways, trying to persuade Myanmar to change its approach to domestic politics, to Aung San Suu Kyi and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying that this is what really worked in the end. It had been a combination of factors. I think the question of China, relations between Myanmar and China, some changes that had taken place, new leadership, Tianjin, all these things impacted upon Myanmar, and we're now beginning to see some change. But one of the things that has not been highlighted in the international media is the role of dialogue in bringing about this change. So I think dialogue has an important role to play. We can give other examples of conflicts that have ended in this region as a result of dialogue. The other famous example from this region in the last 10 years is actually Aceh.
Okay.
Again, it's dialogue.
Yeah.
It was not a war, it was dialogue. And a very eminent negotiator played a role in bringing an end to this long drawn crisis. So I think dialogue, if you look at concrete situations, there are many examples. I would argue that even in the case of Libya, if the African Union plan was given a chance to succeed, and it's so sad that it was sabotaged and subverted. There are many other examples where you can give dialogue a chance, but you're not prepared to give dialogue a chance because you want to pursue your own agenda, you want to use force, and in the end you find that the crisis that develops is much worse. I mean, look at what's happening in Libya now. Yeah. It's run by militias. There's actually no government. Is this what we want?
Mr. Halliday, if you can add on top of that, because you made the point during the break that there's two sides to the UN. One is consisting of the shareholders, the nation. The other one is the professionals, the executives. And if I can link that to the fact that maybe we need to have surrounding the surrounding areas or the surrounding ecosystem must be conducive to a dialogue. But that needs a lot of things. For one would be time. It needs to be given time to work. And I remember critics sitting out at ASEAN for the longest time that ASEAN is just a talk shop, for example. So if we elevate to a bigger and broader platform globally, that would be the United Nations. And that's also one of the main criticism against the United Nations, where it talks about many things, but it hardly achieves anything else, for example. So if we were to promote dialogue, I still think that UN is the best platform because it has a lot of members around the world. But how do we make it really effectively work?
Well, I think we've really got to go to Dr. Mahathir's Perdana philosophy. Okay. That is criminalization of warfare and energizing peace, as he calls it. Because Mr. Obama, when he talks to Iran or other unfriendly countries, I suppose he would think, he always keeps on the table, he calls it, the option of warfare. That's obscene. That should not be allowed. Okay. Warfare is not an option for civilized men and women, or even civilized men and women, including animals who don't clan, as far as I know anyway.
Right.
Warfare. So there is no option. Yeah. Killing other people is just not an option. It's just not acceptable. So there's only one option, and that is dialogue and collaboration and working out the difference. And as Gandhi used to say, walking in the other man's shoes and understanding his life and how it happens. But we have a Security Council, 5 permanent members who together manufacture and sell more than 85% of the weapons in the world today. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest, you might say. We have them responsible for peace and security, but they're arms salesmen.
If you can hold that for a moment, I've got to go for the last break, but I was just going to go into that, the industrial military complex or whatever else you call it, and the fact that we have the Security Council. It will always be linked together and it will always be driven by their own imperatives. So how do we make the UN more inclusive? How can we change the Security Council dynamic? Or can we do away with this Security Council dynamic, for example, and replace it with something else? Because these are just very minority number of members of the UN as compared to the rest. That we'll discuss after this short break. Not going to accept economic sanctions against any country because they're not going to make things better. We're not going to accept that, and of course we're not going to accept war. We must criminalize war, and that initiative, we're proud that is starting strongly in KL. But I want to go to Mr. Halliday now, and at the end of the day, there's still the United Nations and there's still the UN Security Council. Unless that is changed, then we can hardly push for other changes.
Well, we can give up and throw in the towel, but we're not going to do that. We're going to seek change and reform, and that's been discussed for a long time. But I think change is not going to come from within the Council, for obvious reasons. It'll come from outside. And I think the G20 is a model with real potential because it's being driven increasingly by the South as opposed to the crumbling North. And Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, the new countries, India, the huge big economies, at the ASEAN group, these countries together can force the Security Council to adopt a North-South balance, get away from the veto, and have real decision-making on a global level, on a global capacity. That will change everything, because now we've got the Council run by the 5 ancient leaders of the Second World War, with nuclear weapons and with dangerous ambitions, hurting because they've been squeezed back. Europe is shrinking, the Americans are declining, and they're frightened. We need to get the South involved and get a balanced Security Council decision-making process.
Do you see a smooth transition there? Because a lot of people are having doomsday projection for the West coming down and Asia rising.
Yeah. The decline of an empire, if you look at it historically, has never been smooth. And whenever an empire crumbles, it tends to be even more aggressive. And this is what we're witnessing now, because it wants to perpetuate its power. But I want to add to what Denis had said, the very important points that he made about the sort of reforms that are possible. Now, outside the Security Council, we look at the General Assembly. I think if some of the other states became more vocal and were better organized, and upon the G20, I see BRICS as yet another center of power, which has some potential. If they were prepared to push a collective agenda, it is quite possible that one would be able to use even the existing UN Charter to get the General Assembly to play a bigger role on issues of war and peace, uniting for peace resolutions, other types of resolutions. But I think the precondition for that is one must make sure that UN General Assembly members are not pressurized in any way, they're not bribed, they're not bullied. Now, if that can happen, if some change can take place, I think that would be good within the existing UN framework. And more important, I think, it is the changes that we are witnessing today. The shift in power, north, south, west, east. These are the changes that are going to shape the world that is yet to emerge. In that sense, I'm cautiously optimistic about the future. I don't think one can stop what is happening now. The US is declining, it's irreversible. Europe is declining, it's also irreversible, I think. And if you look at the rise of some of the other powers, I think the rise of China in particular, a peaceful rise, the first peaceful rise of a great power in the last 500 years. Because whenever a power has come up, it's always been violent. But China's rise has been peaceful in the sense that she has not conquered anyone's territory, she has not stationed her troops in other people's land and so on. And this, I think, is important for the whole world and for people in Southeast Asia in particular. And we should know how to sort of place ourselves in the midst of this changing scenario.
But what we didn't have then with the rise of the old powers was, for example, the equation of climate change. And people are even talking about a water crisis before, preceding the energy crisis, and that might happen before 2020. And the Mekong Basin, for example, people are going to fight all the way right up until the Himalayas because that's where the water flow starts and stuff like that. So if we look at that and we look at the failure of a lot of talks, Cancun, for example, and where small groups made the decision without even telling the other groups who were there, and it doesn't really give us a lot of optimism, but maybe it's the painful lesson of going towards the end that we want to see achieved.
Well, I'll put it this way, Kamrul, that the crumbling global power structure, which has got many dimensions, politics and security would be just two of those dimensions, economics, and then of course the whole question of ecology, environment, all these dimensions, that I think is one of the reasons why we can be cautiously optimistic. And the rise of different centers of power, and it's not just China, you've got Brazil, you have perhaps Turkey, other countries that are coming up. But I think a third factor, which is also very important, and that became very obvious in the run-up to the Iraq War, it's the role of civil society. Now, if you look at Cancun, for instance, if you look at what happened in Copenhagen, yes, it was a dirty deal, we know that in Copenhagen, but look at the way in which that dirty deal was discredited. It was the work of civil society. They said, look, this is not on. And I think civil society has to play that role in many other areas, arms sales and, in areas connected with well, the global economy and so on.
There's never enough time, but maybe in 30 seconds, if you can sum it up for us. What's your own view on this? Because we have to take silver linings onto the future.
Well, I think the professor made a very important point. He mentioned the General Assembly, which I had omitted. And it is a democratic group, which the Council, of course, never has been. And there's great power there. And the unaligned movement, which is now 140-something countries, could use its Uniting for Peace and other devices to bring the power away from the Council back into the General Assembly. At the same time, I think the reform of the Council should go ahead, and that should be driven from external forces. The forces of reality and survival, not just for the East or the West or the North or the South, but for all of us.
Okay, thank you so much to Professor and to Mr. Halliday. Thanks to you for watching. We'll see you in another episode of Vantage Point very, very soon. But before that, remember, why go for punishment when you can negotiate and dialogue for a more just world? Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.